Marion Baird is Professor of Gender and Employment Relations at the University of Sydney and is Head of the Discipline of Work and Organisational Studies at the University of Sydney Business School. She is one of Australia's leading researchers in the fields of gender and employment. Her research on maternity leave in Australia led to the introduction of Australia's first paid parental leave scheme. Some of her most recent research this year has included an investigation into the life cycle of women's employment in Australia and inequality markers. She has also recently written an article for the Sydney Morning Herald on how working from home is nothing new to mothers. She agreed to talk to me via Zoom about the impact of COVID-19 for women and working environments. I asked Professor Baird what, in her view, are the major challenges for women in the workplace.
Well, I suppose they start from entering the workforce out of university. So women are much more highly educated in Australia than elsewhere. They outstrip men. What I've argued is that across the life course, there are particular points in their lives where we see the disadvantage sort of starting and then compounding. So the first few years are reasonably equivalent with men, except in terms of pay. They start their labour market attachment with a pay gap, and then that compounds through their life. Then the next big area where they are disadvantaged is having children, and there's sort of no two ways around that. So having children, those that do, affects their attachment, obviously, to the labour market. On return, it often means they reduce their hours, which sends, in many cases, a signal that they're not committed full-time workers. It also reduces their pay and their superannuation, and it can often impact on their career progression. So returning to work after childbirth is a significant break. And then many women sort of then work hard to catch up. So, it's not like it's all gone, but there is then what they have to do is really work harder over the next phase to sort of catch up with where they would have been had they not left the workforce. But using flexible work hours, which is very welcome in many cases, can also be have a negative impact on them. And then as they get older, they can strike the other caring demands of grandchildren and elder care. So they may either leave the labour market or withdraw their effort from promotion, extra opportunities, training and development. So they sort of may stay at work but not put in as much time to the activities that would enable them to increase their positions.
I asked Professor Baird whether she sees flexible working arrangements as a positive thing.
For women who have children in the context of the Australian system, and often the British system as well, flexible work options are about the only way they can manage keeping their career and having children, or keeping some semblance of a career and having children. Because men, until COVID, and this might be a bit of a break in behaviours, but men tend not to work as flexibly or take as many flexible work options as women, and they're often denied them in higher proportions than women. So there's a bit more of a stigma attached to men taking or using flexible work, and employers are much more reluctant to allow men to work flexibly than women. So it's sort of a positive in the sense that that's the way working families in Australia have structured lives within the constraints that we have. But it does have, over time, potentially a negative outcome on women's overall life course careers. There's quite a lot of reluctance of women when they get to a particular stage in their careers to take on more senior management positions, because they see that those positions are so time-consuming and there is this notion that they can't be done flexibly in the same way that slightly lower levels often can. So in the public sector, for example, there's also sort of a barrier in terms of when you move out of, I can't remember what term they use, into the executive service, your ability to opt for flexibility is different to below that. That happens in a lot of organisations, whether it's a hard barrier to enable flexibility or a perceived barrier, it does have that impact. Of course, People in more senior positions often have more autonomy over their hours, however. So it's sort of that need to jump that hurdle and say, okay, I will move into that more senior position and then work out how to do the hours. But from the research we've done, a lot of women sit just below that and say those hours look too much, too intimidating, I can't deal with them, and not go into those positions.
During the pandemic, many of us have been forced to work from home. I asked Professor Baird if she thought workplaces would change permanently as a result of this experience.
I suspect they will change permanently. And that won't just be because of the flexibility, it'll be because of the need for more physical distancing, and use of space will differ. And already we can see comments in the media about businesses who are not going to use as much floor space, and they're going to encourage people to work from home a couple of days a week. That was happening before anyway, because rents were so high, they could see we don't need so much space. So I think it will change. My worry is that women may be forced to work from home, and that may be not something they all want, because actually going into work is a psychological shift as well as a physical one. So I am concerned that there won't be the flexibility around flexibility, if you know what I mean. It will actually force people to work some days from home, so that the employer is sort of shifting the responsibility for providing a workspace to the home. And not all households can afford or have the room to have an office and a space for someone to work in.
The coronavirus pandemic has led to a lot of discussion in the media about the working week and how it is structured. Only recently, New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern suggested that employers consider a 4-day working week and other flexible work options as a way of encouraging tourism post-COVID and to address persistent issues of work-life balance. I asked Professor Baird whether she thought the 9-to-5 working model was outdated.
I do agree with that, although I do think the 9-to-5 model was already breaking down. It's certainly true that the working day doesn't match the school day, which is what a lot of working parents, especially mothers, find difficult to deal with. So they then adapt their own work behaviours to fit that. And going back to your first question, that can be a disadvantage for them. But it's what they do because they do want to provide a good family life, and they do want to be good mothers. You know, it's the tension between being a good worker and a good mother. And our research shows they want to be both. Australian mothers, and I'll talk because we have done a lot of work with Australian mothers, they really want to be good mothers and good workers. So I do think the 9-to-5 model was already breaking down, but maybe COVID will have hastened that. And other elements will come into play as well, such as transport systems. And I think that will shift the way in which we organise our days at work.
Many employers have this perception that if you're not actually in the office, you're not working. I asked Professor Baird if she thought that COVID had kind of broken down those barriers slightly.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that will shift, that notion of presenteeism, having to be in the office. But also, what I think may have shifted is what supervisors or team leaders and managers have experienced through COVID, that they now can see people do work at home, which is what they didn't see so easily before. And I think the use of this technology, interestingly, will be used as well. So I think it'll be easier to call a Zoom meeting of all team members, whether or not they're in the office or not, and it'll be expected that that can be done. So, yeah, I think COVID will change it. Whether or not everyone wants to do it that way, you know, workers themselves, going back to that issue of would you rather sit in the bedroom at home or go into an office place, that's the question we have to resolve still.
Professor Baird gave her views on whether employers' attitudes towards working from home had changed, and also what we may have learnt from the pandemic.
I think the big thing we may have learnt is that men, fathers, can work flexibly as well and can work from home. And if that shifts, then it could be a real benefit for mothers, working mothers. I think employers have seen that people can work from home and can still be productive. And men have experienced a different working life, a different pattern. Some may have enjoyed it, some may not. We're waiting for the data on that, we just don't know yet. There's quite a few surveys. There's a couple of good surveys out now. The Australian Institute of Family Studies are doing one, and Melbourne Uni. And those two studies will try and get a bit of a sense of, has the division of labour at home changed through COVID, which would enable men to realise what's being done, or has it actually, the other possibility is that in some cases it might have entrenched a more female homemaker person and a male caregiver. So I think COVID could have polarised the working population. And the reason I think that is because for women in professional, reasonably paid jobs possibly fared quite well through this period. But women in lower paid jobs where they could work at home or lost their jobs altogether will not have fared very well. And for those women, I do fear that for them the experience might have been, well, I didn't have such a good job before. Maybe just staying at home, doing the house things, making the bread, doing the shopping, it might have shifted those roles a bit. And I don't know if that's a positive or a negative, but I do think COVID may have polarised the outcome. Yeah, because we do tend to talk about working from home as if everyone can do it. Not everybody can. There are plenty of jobs that you can't do that. And as we've seen, a lot of those jobs have been the jobs women were in, retail and hospitality.